invite Professor SM Patnaik, Head Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi, and former Vice Chancellor, Utkal University, to deliver the keynote address.
सर आपका फोन है? Honorable Dean Social Sciences, Professor Sunita Rani Madam, Professor B.V. Sharma, Director of the prestigious ANSI and the star of the occasion, respected guest of honor, revered Professor Ratha, respected Basa, Professor Sahai, Head of the Department Professor Ramesh Singh, Conference Convener Dr. Srinivas, my esteemed colleagues from this prestigious Hyderabad Department and different parts of India, Professor Shiva Prasad, Professor Amitabh Pandey, Professor Subho Roy, Professor Grigory, Dr. Reddy, Sunita Reddy Madam, and dear research scholars and students, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know that Professor K.K. Chakravarti was to deliver this keynote address, and because he could not make it for health reason, I am replacing him, and I consider it as my privilege and an opportunity given to me by my colleagues. I am extremely thankful for this role which has been assigned to me on this historic occasion. Madam Dean was talking in the morning that there is a metaphor, and I take the metaphor of the flow. Institutions are flow. They are flow of ideas. They are flow of time, flow of genealogies. And this department has made a distinct identity. And we all have realized it in our last many decades. What is the uniqueness of this prestigious department of Hyderabad? It has made anthropology relevant. And if there is any meta-narrative which the department can be identified with, is making anthropology relevant. Professor B.V. Sharma, along with his other colleagues, Professor Shiva Prasad and rest of them, have been able to create a network for bringing the anthropologists, practitioners, policymakers, and communities together for a meaningful dialogue. And the seminar, with a apt title, Anthropology in Contemporary Practice, with special reference to health, education, environment, digital culture, and urban life. Now, what I am going to argue in this particular deliberations, I would like to argue that if we take a historically informed view of anthropology in practice, it is very clear that the disciplinary practice have continuously evolved and have continuously invented new vocabulary that convey the similar or comparable meaning. I would like to examine these epistemes, how different meanings at different points of time has enriched the anthropological practice. How the new vocabulary to convey the nuanced differences at different points of anthropological practice. I'll come to it towards the middle part of my lecture. But examination of these trajectories clearly reveal that if anthropology has to continue to remain relevant, not only by the Department of Hyderabad, but other departments, because there are many best practices of this department, as Professor Basa was telling, that how the way of respecting each other in terms of a rich collegiality and giving goodbye or farewell with dignity and respect by the youngsters. So if anthropology has to continue to be relevant, not only here but different parts of India, I argue that it has to invent the ways of being responsible. And this idea of responsibility is an important metaphor or an important invention which has to be done in multiple ways. The question of responsibility has always been central to anthropology, even if it has not been stated very clearly. Say, for example, the outcome of anthropological work has been used or abused by one or other stakeholders. The late 19th century and early 20th century ethnographers worked hand in hand with the system of colonial administration, producing categories such as tribe, caste, primitive, that became the language of the governance. And these labels were not neutral. They shaped how the entire populations were administered and understood. There has always been a doubt about what anthropologists do in the colonial and post-colonial time. Some ambiguity, some kind of taking a pause and then reflecting upon. I was sitting on the Indo-Myanmar border as an advisor to government of Nagaland. We were promoting cultural tourism or different kinds of tourism. One of the community members stood up after our introduction and he said to the district collector that I understand why the economists are here, the gender specialists are here, environmental planners are there, but what the anthropologist is doing here, it is telling, I am telling 2007, 2006, the story. So anthropologists are always taken with a pinch of salt. In 1968, Gerald Berman wrote an article, Is Anthropology Alive? In other words, he was trying to argue, what is the social responsibility of anthropology? And primarily he was talking of social anthropology. And he also argued that to be detached, to claim that one is neutral, is a myth. And anthropology needs to align with the politics of truth and in a wider sense, align with democracy and democratic practices. Similarly, very recently in 2023, an important volume came up titled Anthropology and Responsibility from Routledge and written by or edited by Melissa Demian, Mattia Fumanti, Christo Linteris. The editors in their introduction argue that responsibility is not a static principle, but a principle that is relational and situated in practice. As a value, it critically engages with social, ethical, political, and epistemological questions. Thus, anthropology cannot escape from such kind of commitments. Responsibility, I argue, is central to anthropological theory, ethnographic practice, collaborative research, and applied engagement. It arises from conditions of fieldwork, the expectations of communities, and the pressures of institutions. Responsibility has always been partial. We cannot carry every burden of the community, and therefore responsibility necessitates reflexivity. It requires reflexivity about whom we study, whom we serve, and when we should intervene, and what consequences follow from our research. And that is what Professor Sharma just argued, that study in itself has no meaning. It must have consequences. Training students only as a technician without moral awareness or writing about communities without accountability will not serve any purpose. In other words, responsibility or responsible anthropology is not an option. It is not an optional extra. It is constitutive of anthropology's claim for relevance. If anthropology is claiming to be relevant, the idea of responsibility is constitutive of anthropologist's claim for relevance. In this sense, without social responsibility, anthropology becomes a sterile profession, sterile professionalism, which may be descriptive, at times analytical, but disconnected from human dignity. That is what Professor Rath in the morning very clearly reminded us about Ruth Benedict's idea. Anthropology may describe the world, but may remain disconnected from human dignity, justice. And with responsibility, anthropology can become a discipline that not only studies the world, but also helps to make it more human. So this responsibility of the discipline to make the world more human, more understanding. I will quickly browse through some of the Indian trajectories of responsible anthropology. We know that there has been several attempts, even in the pre-colonial and post-colonial stage. One of the attempts which I would like to bring when I am standing on the soil of Telangana and soil of Hyderabad, Christoph von Führer-Hemmendorf. He was advisor in 1945, advisor to Nizam on tribes and backward classes. He advocated for the land rights for the Chenchus, urging the Nizam to issue pattas that recognized their tenure. It was Hemmendorf's work marked with a combination of empathy with concrete evidence leading to policy intervention. His career illustrates one possible model for responsible anthropology. Scholarship that informs and scholarship that is accountable to the well-being of the communities being studied. We also have other scholars around that time. Verrier Elwin, Thakkar Bapa, and again Verrier Elwin's debate on policy of isolation, assimilation, and integration, which was the middle path. N.K. Bose was also talking about how to connect the diverse, so-called disconnected tribal and indigenous populations by developing the idea of Indian mainstream. And Indian mainstream was a value-loaded idea, but still, as an anthropologist, he could do it without much debate and controversy. Modernization of economic institutions, democracy, secularism, non-violence as edifice of Indian mainstream, so that anthropologists can connect with peace, with dignity, with all aspects of modernization and democracy. We also know several scholars like D.N. Majumdar's involvement in National Planning Commission's Research Program Committee. Majumdar viewed anthropology as a tool for policy making, administration and social work, because the same institution, Department of Economics in Lucknow, has given rise to 3 departments: sociology, economics, social work and anthropology. So Majumdar was also looking at anthropology playing significant role in social work, administration and policy making. He also very clearly identified that rehabilitation process must take into account, I'm reading it as development process or rehabilitation process must take into account the hopes and aspirations of the people. Every culture has a right to its own way of life, to the development of its traditional culture. B.K. Roy Burman, I was discussing with Professor Basa this early morning, B.K. Roy Burman's grounded approach in the Northeast when he undertook Padayatras to connect with the people. And when I was doing field work as an advisor to Government of Nagaland for the tourism project, every household I would go, they would first ask that, do you know Professor Roy Burman? Roy Burman was a household name in Nagaland. And his way of connecting to the people was nothing less than the responsible anthropology or anthropological practice with responsibility. Now, I would like to summarize, before winding up, I would like to summarize that how the shifting episteme has been revolving around anthropological responsibility. We all know that colonial practices have taught us not to pay much attention to applied anthropology. Applied anthropology, a term in itself, was regarded as something which we should avoid. There was an international commission on applied anthropology by IUAES, which became defunct after 3-4 years or after 6-7 years, because the term applied anthropology could not attract much of the anthropological attention. So the idea on applied anthropology, of course, Vidyarthi wrote a significant volume in 45 years before, 1979, Applied Anthropology, an edited volume where all these stalwarts had their paper. Vidyarthi argued that land, education, health, impact of heavy industries, they need to be addressed or they need to be studied by anthropologists. And anthropologists must address concrete development issues. Then the episteme shifted from applied anthropology. Some people invented the term application of anthropological knowledge. And application of anthropological knowledge gave them some edge to push back the colonial term of applied anthropology, to play down the administrative undertone. But the application of anthropological knowledge created a great binary between theoretical practice and application. The third episteme came up from the idea of public anthropology. Now, public anthropology believed that the voice of marginalized needs to be articulated, but not in the mode of a sentimental activism, not in the mode of a serious anachronistic manner, but as an interlocutor with evidence, with perspective, which can be brought to the wider public. So balancing the critique and the engagement was the purpose of public anthropology, and if it has to play in a responsible way. Then it shifted towards an interesting term which we call as engaged anthropology. Engaged anthropology necessitated ethical commitment, not just to study, but to stand with and to advocate, co-create the solutions along with the communities. And engaged anthropology tried to bridge the binary between theoretical and applied. Research, advocacy, policy, activism, all are seen as morally and methodologically intertwined. One of the recent avatars of responsible anthropology is one of the recent incarnations of responsible anthropology, I could say, dialogical anthropology. Genuine dialogue is established between the community. Communities are the co-producer of the knowledge. Anthropology and community both are collaborators, and challenging the absolute power of an outsider and power to represent. So to sum up this part, I would like to argue that contemporary anthropological practice necessitates or needs to recognize the reciprocity. The reciprocal relationship between the community being studied and anthropologists have never been addressed to or attended to. I remember Professor Trilokinath Pandey wrote a long ago, Professor Rath will correct me, should informants be paid? Even Professor Vinay Srivastava also wrote a piece, should informants be paid? But when we are talking about informants be paid, we are talking what Master Shahlin would talked about, the balanced reciprocity. But what about a generalized reciprocity? What about a reciprocity in a long term? So community accountability and co-production of knowledge is recognizing is prioritizing a reciprocal relationship with the community and anthropologist. And it requires humility. And that is an important aspect. If we are talking about human values, anthropologists need to be humble to the communities. Our category may not capture their reality. We may realize that our category is not able to capture their reality, but their insight may transform our theory. And this is precisely where an anthropology from India and anthropology for India should emphasize that how an anthropology need not be value loaded from either from the Western theories or from our own arrogance, but it must be a humble seeker of the insightful knowledge that may transform our theory. Responsible anthropology requires commitment to ethics. It demands reflexivity. What should we study? Should we study everything? Who benefits from the study? Who gains recognition? And at whose cost? These are the moral and ethical questions which anthropology in contemporary practice must address. To sum up, without taking much time, I would say that anthropology is the study of lived experiences, study of structure, meaning, motivation, and action. How does it study? It studies in three different modes: synchronic, diachronic, and virtual. Synchronic, diachronic, and digital. And therefore, contemporary reality before the anthropologist is an expansive entity. It is constantly expanding. And therefore comes the challenge. Madam was talking in the morning. Past is there in present, which contains the seeds of future. And that is how we have to understand the reality around us as an anthropologist. But anthropologists are also very, very concerned about, or as anthropologists, we should be concerned about how the interface between individual and connectivity is manifested in this post-colonial and globalized world. The interface between individual and collectivity is, I would argue, getting more technology driven. Individual and collectivity. Tradition is only serving the purpose of memory, and culture is only for celebration. But in this context, as an anthropologist, I would also like to argue that it doesn't mean that the culture is disappearing. It doesn't mean that the structure is vanishing. And therefore, the responsibility comes in a very significant way when the interface between individual and collectivity is getting disenchanted. Tradition, technology, and individual is creating some kind of disembodiment. And here comes two of the concepts about individual in a post-human stage, post-human society. I would like to quote the feminist anthropologist Sandra Harding, her concept of cyborg, C-Y-B-O-R-G, and Donna Haraway, half body and half technology. If technology is taken out from my body, I am immobile. And therefore, this post-human condition where individuals are understood in terms of half body and half technology. The disability studies also tells us about prosthesis, how prosthesis is, human bodies are technologically driven, and also the contemporary youth talking, interacting with AI. They switch on AI and talk to them. They don't need friends. AI is their best friend. AI is their companion. AI is their sweetheart and everything. So, Donna Haraway and Sandra Harding has attempted a critique of scientific method and its epistemological construct. What I am trying to argue here is the notion of individual is changing in anthropology because of the technology. But I would like to remind all of us here that when the Western scholars are talking about the danger of technology taking over the body, of one's own body or other's body, there are Indian alternatives available for a post-human order. I would like to quote Sri Aurobindo's contribution on a post-human condition. According to Sri Aurobindo, human beings are not the final stage of evolution on the earth. If Western scholars are talking about the evolution of the body through technology or adaptation of the body through technology, Indian philosophers are talking about evolution of human beings through transcending the mind, through a supermind, through a superconsciousness, supramental consciousness. And this supramental consciousness is the epicenter of emerging Indian self. If you have to talk about how an Indian notion of personhood, an Indian way of understanding the self, whether it is an indigenous community, the Dalit self, is a tribal self, or it is your own self, because that is what ethnography teaches us to bridge the gap between self and other. Transcending the body could be one of the arguments from the soil of India. In a post-human condition, maybe transcendence contains the clue. Even I have no confirmed answer to this. But what I prefer, or I would like to submit before this august audience, that there are important ways of understanding the epistemic shifts in and around applied anthropology. But we all have understood that if anthropology has to be relevant, it needs to take up the responsibility. And this responsibility need not be towards the community. This responsibility is also towards our own members of the community. And when we nurture the collegiality with great humility, and when we nurture the collegiality with great commitment and sincerity, the discipline flourishes. And I think Professor Sharma's work and life in this institutional and academic flow of the Department of Anthropology, University of Hyderabad, is a testimony to this. I congratulate him on his superannuation, and I congratulate this Department of Anthropology, Hyderabad University, for establishing such a wonderful intellectual flow across generations. All my best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you.